Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As you can see on my slide, I want to get to know you a little bit. While folks join in, we have about 40 participants coming. So we have a good little number. So we'll get started in just a couple minutes. But while we're waiting, let's make sure we know how to use some of our Zoom technology. If you can in the chat, can you please type in where you're zooming from? So where you're currently at, and the last really cool bird that you saw. I will not enter mine in the chat since I'm allowed to talk, but I'm currently in Loveland, Colorado. And the last really cool bird that I saw, we've been seeing some northern shrikes, which is really cool. I enjoy seeing the shrikes. So while we're getting settled in, feel free to type into the chat where you're zooming from and what was the last really cool bird that you saw. With these webinars, it's really cool. I feel like we get a lot of folks that are not in the Colorado area. So it's cool to see where people are from and what they're seeing. I know there's some crazy stuff in Denver right now. I don't know if anyone's gone out to see the Pyroluxia, but I haven't. Hi, Jansen Highland Ranch, bush tits. Hannah, ooh, I hear you're eating a goose. Was that at the office? All right, Angela saw the Pyroluxia, which is super cool. I think I'm saying that right. That's a weird one. There you go, New York, snow buntings on the beach. Oh, that sounds kind of nice right now. American Dipper. Ooh, Harlequin ducks. That's awesome. All right, thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate everyone coming and joining us this evening. Maybe you are having a happy hour with your Zoom meeting. We're going to learn a lot about grouse conservation with Marcella. So while we're just getting settled, feel free to type into the chat where you're at, so where you're zooming from today. And the last really cool bird that you saw, looks like some folks are seeing some cool birds. So we definitely have some bird folks here, which is always good. And I am actually going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to pass it over to Marcella in just a second. So just some quick housekeeping before we get started. All your videos are off, unfortunately. It would be great to see everyone's face, but I just don't want to overload our Zoom today and get a little distracted. Also, all of your mics are muted, so feel free to talk amongst yourselves and we won't hear you or during this presentation. If you have any questions that come up, we're going to be using that chat feature, which we just tried using. So thank you for those that typed that in. So if any questions that come up, feel free to just type those into the chat. I will try my best to answer them. And if I have no idea, we'll pass it over to Marcella towards the end, and she'll be sure to answer your questions at the end. So we're going to get started. My name is Tyler Cash, and I am the camp manager for the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And I'll be the host of this webinar. So if you have any technical issues or anything that comes up, feel free to just enter that into the chat and I'll try to help you as best as I can. And we are very lucky to be joined this evening by our presenter, Marcella Tarantino from our stewardship team. Thank you so much for taking the time, Marcella, to present about all the cool work that you do, about the stewardship team, and then also a little bit about your history and what got you into what you do now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Marcella, you can take it away.
Thanks, Tyler. Give me 1 second to get this set up.
Yeah, while you're doing that, it looks like some folks are entering into the chat too, which is some cool things. Vermilion flycatcher in Florida.
All right, does that look good to everybody?
Yep, that's good. Thanks, Marcella.
All right, perfect. Well, thanks everyone for joining today. Our topic is grouse conservation in Colorado, and I'm based in Gunnison, Colorado, so I'll focus specifically on Gunnison Sage-Grouse with a little bit of information on greater sage-grouse as well. If you guys are not familiar with Bird Conservancy, our mission is to conserve birds and their habitats through an integrated approach of science education and land stewardship. And today I'll be talking entirely about the stewardship side. And we work on collaborative conservation delivery with private landowners. So I will talk more about how that process works as well. Please go ahead and drop questions throughout into the chat, like Tyler said. I probably won't be able to answer them as we go, but I'm happy to answer anything at the end too. And to give you kind of an idea of where we're going today, I wanted to give you guys an introduction to the stewardship team and what we do, and then a little bit of an introduction to me and how I got onto the stewardship team. And then we'll spend the bulk of the presentation talking about sage-grouse life histories and habitat restoration with sage-grouse in mind. So I don't know how much people know about the stewardship team already, so I'm going to give kind of a brief overview. But we all are based across the Western United States and all work on private lands wildlife habitat restoration. So this is a map of the area that all of our biologists cover. The stars are the cities they're based in, and then the colored areas are the counties or areas they service. So I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I'm based down here in Gunnison, Colorado. And I have this kind of odd shaped set of areas that I cover, which is the range of Gunnison Sage-Grouse. So it's a little bit different than a lot of the other positions, which you can see are based off of county boundaries. And that's because my position was based entirely on working on Gunnison Sage-Grouse conservation. So all of the biologists are working in an area that has some sort of target, whether it's working on grassland conservation, wetland conservation, forestry, or sagebrush. And we have about 9 to 10 biologists across 6 states, so they all have some sort of different habitat or species they work with. But the common theme is that we're all based in Natural Resources Conservation Service offices, and then we work with their Farm Bill funding programs to provide landowners with opportunities to do habitat restoration. So like I said, my position is really specialized in sagebrush habitat restoration, and particularly in Gunnison Sage-Grouse. Gunnison Sage-Grouse were listed as a federally threatened species in 2014, and so that catalyzed a lot of efforts to work with private landowners on habitat restoration. But it's not necessarily all about Gunnison Sage-Grouse. While they are certainly the highest priority species from a, as far as being like a charismatic species, most of the work for Gunnison Sage-Grouse will benefit all sorts of other sagebrush obligate species. So some examples are brewer sparrow, sagebrush sparrow, green-tailed towhee, and sage thrasher. And on top of that, most of the work will also benefit winter habitat for mule deer, elk, bighorn sheep, and pronghorn. And because we're working with private landowners, that's a really critical element, because most of them are first and foremost interested in making sure that they have good habitat for their livestock. But a lot of them are really interested in big game species. And so this is great that that overlaps with grouse, because then we can address needs for all of those species. So a little bit of background about me. All of the stewardship biologists have pretty different backgrounds. But for me, I grew up in Golden, Colorado, and I grew up camping and hiking with my family and friends. And that definitely inspired a love for the outdoors and for wildlife. And I was really fortunate to be in a school district where we had opportunities to take field-based courses, even in high school. And so that was also a huge inspiration for me. So even by the time I was going into my undergraduate, I knew that I wanted to be a field biologist and work on conservation projects. So I went to Western State College in Gunnison, which is now Western Colorado University, and got my degree in wildlife and ecology. And they're really hands-on. So this is a picture of trapping bighorn sheep for vaccination. So they have all sorts of cool opportunities like that for their students. And you get to go out with land managers and do all sorts of habitat measurements and population surveys and that kind of thing. So my very first let count was in 2008. And I'll talk a little bit more about what a let count is, but it's, in short, it's a population survey for grouse. And then from there, after I graduated, I stayed in Gunnison for a couple more years as a technician. So I was working seasonally, like 6 months at a time. And I worked for the Forest Service for 3 summers doing tree surveys. So I was on a timber crew doing habitat surveys and insect and disease surveys. And then we did some forestry implementation. So that's a picture of me collecting cones for growing out trees to restore areas that had been hit by beetles pretty hard. And then, so that was my summer position. And then in winters, I worked for Parks and Wildlife, also in Gunnison. My boss described it as all things grouse. So I was writing conservation agreements, working on a trap and transplant project to move grouse from Gunnison into some of the areas that they're not doing quite as well. and then tracking those grouse, and then again doing lek surveys. So that was a great introduction to grouse and the issues they face in Gunnison, as well as a good introduction to working with landowners and on all of the habitat restoration opportunities too. And then from there, I decided to go to Boise to get my graduate degree. I went to Boise State University with Dr. Jen Forby and co-advised by Dr. Jack Connolly. And there I was studying sage-grouse foraging ecology and winter habitat use. So that was a great opportunity to learn more in-depth information about habitat use by grouse. So really all of this work tied in extremely well to my current position because it was largely grouse based. So doing a ton of things with them through a lot of different seasons, which gave me a good background in grouse biology in general. And then I did get to learn a little bit about a few different kinds of restoration practices as well. So that set me up very well for the current work I do. So here, I started out in Montrose about 6.5 years ago, and the position kind of transitioned over into Gunnison about 3.5 years ago. So I've been working in both areas in the same service area, so still all of the Gunnison Sage-Grouse habitat. And the job position is still the same, working with private landowners to address the habitat needs for sage-grouse. And we also, as private lands biologists, that's the primary duty that we do, but we also host workshops to try to encourage landowners to join and work on restoration activities. And we also will help with some wildlife surveys and assessments for some of the state game and fish or parks and wildlife agencies. So from here, I want to jump into the world of grouse biology. I know it looked like there were people joining from all over, including New York, so I'm hoping that this is useful. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background about what a grouse is in general, and then we'll dive into Gunnison and greater sage-grouse so you guys can be pretty familiar with them by the time we talk about restoration for them. So in general, grouse are in the group Galliforms, so they're relatively large, ground-dwelling, and chicken-like birds. Many of the species have a breeding lek, and we'll come back to this over and over throughout the presentation, but a lek is an area where males gather. So this photo here is a great example of a lek. There are many males, and then females will come and kind of peruse through the males and decide if they want to mate with one of them that day. And a lek can be defined two ways. It's either a gathering of males, or in the Western US, we often just use it as a distinct geographic location. So that's what I'll refer to it as throughout the presentation from a restoration standpoint. Another interesting characteristic of grouse is that they have pretty unique feathers. They're almost all of them are extremely cryptically colored. So because they're ground-based birds, they don't typically spend a lot of time in the air, and they blend in with all sorts of stripes and modeling. So I'll show you pictures of what they look like. And the other really cool thing that grouse have is these little feathers on the edge of their toes. And these act as snowshoes. So grouse are all found in northern latitudes from Svalbard, Norway, down to Texas is the furthest south they go. So they're well adapted to cold environments and snow. And they also, because of that lek mating system, they have some pretty other crazy feathers that are, I'll show you pictures throughout, but they're mostly used for selecting a mate. So they have all sorts of unique feathers on them. And then another interesting trait is that they're all pretty much herbivores. Some of them will eat insects as they're growing or when they're seasonally available, but most of these birds eat plants. And the other thing that is true of almost all grouse species is that they're environmental indicators, meaning as their habitat changes, their populations will reflect that. So we can use, say, sage-grouse to evaluate the health of sagebrush ecosystems. And so that's a really important point for restoration, is that we can measure our restoration success by measuring populations and vice versa. So I work on Gunnison sage-grouse. I'm going to talk about them first, but I'll also give you guys some information about greater sage-grouse, which is the other species of sage-grouse grouse in the western United States. Gunnison Sage-Grouse are sagebrush obligate, so they live in sagebrush habitats their whole year. This is a picture of one displaying, so it's in spring. They have these really distinctly barred tail feathers. That's kind of their unique characteristic. And then these are some of those weird feathers I talked about they're called Phyllo Plumes, and they use them for their display. And then one of the other characteristics of grouse that I think people are most awed by is these are essentially a part of the esophagus that expands and contracts in their display, and they use it to create sound as they're dancing for females. Gunnison sage-grouse are found only in southwestern Colorado and southeastern Utah. So this is the gray is the historic range and the yellow is current. They only live in about 7 to 12% of their historic habitat, so they're pretty restricted in where they live. And they live in these non-contiguous subpopulations. So for all of the restoration practices, they'll vary a little bit population to population, depending on what kind of habitat exists in that area. But really all of the restoration practices can be used in any of these areas. And then I have a little video of sage-grouse displaying, which hopefully will play. It's a little bit slow. But I would highly recommend, if you guys want to see more, you are welcome to check them out on YouTube or somewhere else, wherever you can. They inflate and deflate those air sacs really quickly, and that's what creates that bubbling noise. And in this, you can also see them tossing their heads, and that throws those Phyllo Plumes. So that's also an important part of their display. And this is all on a lek. So these birds are displaying for hens that are just not in the screen. And a lot of the traits of this display are what was used to distinguish them as a separate species from greater sage-grouse. So greater sage-grouse are really similar in a lot of ways, and so that's why I wanted to talk about them a little bit too. Greater sage-grouse are definitely more widespread, and there are more of them, so we often will use them for research as a proxy for Gunnison sage-grouse, so that you can have low disturbance research, but then apply the results to Gunnison sage-grouse as well. So all of the habitat requirements and restoration techniques that we use are transferable between Gunnison and greater sage-grouse. This is a picture of a greater sage-grouse. They're overall really similar. They lack that barring on their tails, so this is just plain modeling. And then they don't have those big fancy Phyllo Plumes. I always think of them more as like little bald old men that just have a little bald spot on top. They just don't have quite the same pizzazz. They do also have the same air sacs. Those are just hidden in the folds of his chest. And then greater sage-grouse, as their name implies, are also substantially larger. They occupy a much bigger area. So the dark green is the current range of greater sage-grouse, and then the lighter color is the historic range. They only occupy about 50% of where they used to be, but their habitat is relatively contiguous compared to Gunnison sage-grouse, and they still occupy a decent proportion comparatively. The population estimate here is shown as about 350,000. That's somewhat variable. I think the latest IUCN report showed them at 150,000. So there's certainly still in decline as well. So then I did want to also provide a video of this because they are somewhat unique. And again, their display was largely how they were distinguished between Gunnison and greater sage-grouse. Gunnison sage-grouse was just declared a species in 2000, so it's relatively new. So they both have really cool ranges of noises that they make in the lek. The squeak that you hear is from them rubbing their wing against those white feathers on their chest. Those are really stiff feathers, kind of like your fingernail. And then they also make the noises from the air sacs. So again, I totally encourage you guys to look up grouse on YouTube if you want to check out any more, not even just Gunnison and greater sage-grouse, but all of the grouse, lek and grouse species have really amazing displays. So definitely worth checking out. So now we're going to spend more of the talking about the habitat needs and then how we can improve habitat for sage-grouse. So when we look at habitat, we really break it into three main components, and it's based off of what they're doing throughout the year. So we have breeding season habitat, which we can further break into lekking and nesting, and I'll talk more about that here in a minute. Then we have brood rearing habitat, which can be broken down further into early and late, but for our purposes, we're just going to call it brood rearing habitat. And then there's winter habitat. And we'll talk about how all of these can be improved and then what you need to essentially fit into these categories. So for breeding habitat, again, a lek is just the gathering of males, but it is a distinct geographic location. So you can point on a map and say, this is exactly where the lek is, and it typically doesn't move much. And birds will typically come back to it year after year. And those areas are free of tall vegetation that just provides better visual and acoustic properties for females to be looking around at males. And then associated with leks are nesting habitat, which usually occurs within like a mile to maximum of about 4 miles from a lek. And those areas have really dense sagebrush and a dense understory. So all of the bunch grasses and wildflowers there provide extra cover for nests while the females are sitting around. And the nest, like I said, should be near a lek site usually, but they're also often near brood rearing habitat because when the chicks hatch, they can't walk too far on a day-to-day basis. So it's definitely to the hen's advantage if they're near brood rearing habitat that they can get to pretty quickly. So brood rearing habitat, they're really looking for insects for the chicks to eat, and then they'll also eat some of the high protein forbs. Forb is a fancy word for wildflower, so that's really what they're looking for. And wet meadows are a really great source for both of those. So these two pictures are good examples of a kind of classic wet meadow. Occasionally, some years they'll use aspen stands too, which is really somewhat unusual. Wet meadows are really more of the classic brood rearing habitat that we'd look for. But the unique thing about them is that there aren't a lot of them. So they're only about 1 to 2% of the landscape across the West. And because of the way the West was settled, it's very largely based on private land. So working with private landowners is really critical to grouse persistence, because brood recruitment into the adult population is usually one of the limiting factors for population increases. So to be able to increase a population, you have to have good wet meadows, and so those are often on private lands. So that's really probably one of the most critical aspects of working on private lands. Winter habitat is not usually considered to be a limiting factor. Grouse eat 100% sagebrush throughout winter. So really anywhere they can find tall or palatable species of sagebrush works for them. Some areas, there's not even that much snow over winter and they have access to almost all of the sagebrush. Areas like Gunnison, Colorado or North Park, Colorado, that get substantial snow loads can be a little bit harder for them to find what they need. But these grouse are well adapted to finding things like windswept ridges or tall sagebrush in a drainage and that kind of thing. So usually we don't worry too much about winter habitat just because it's usually not the limiting factor for populations. Usually also birds have extraordinarily high survival rates, like above 95% during winter. So it's usually not driving population demographics. Another unique characteristic of sage-grouse is that they're philopatric, which means they're home-loving. So they'll return to the same lek sites frequently. Females will often nest within a couple hundred meters of a previous nest site. And then the birds are also non-migratory. they can use pretty large home ranges and have somewhat of a seasonal movement cycle, but for the most part, they really don't make too big of movements, not like they're going to Mexico or anything. So this idea of being philopatric and needing the same spot year after year is certainly something that has become, I would say, a factor in their decline, because they need those same areas not to change. That can be a real detriment with the pace of habitat change that we see in the sagebrush rangelands. Birds will often return to the same spot, whether it's good for them or not. So like this photo here is a great example of birds coming to a lek right next to an oil rig. And then in those scenarios, it's hard for the birds to hear one another, and then females will choose not to mate with them. And then eventually the lek can be abandoned. And so that's an important factor for grouse, is that because they return to the same area, they're definitely susceptible to changes that occur. And unfortunately, their habitats do change pretty rapidly. So as a result of those changes and habitat fragmentation, both of these species are in decline. Gunnison Sage-Grouse is federally threatened and greater sage-grouse is not. They've been petitioned multiple times in the past, and I think it would be reasonable to expect them to continue getting listing petitions in the future. They're both listed as state species of conservation need at the highest level. Their population sizes, you can see, are quite different. So Gunnison Sage-Grouse after the 2021 LEC counts was estimated to have around 3,500 birds globally. Greater sage-grouse, the estimates will vary pretty widely, but the IUCN suggested around 150,000 birds, which across the area that they cover is still not a huge number of birds. And again, both of them occupy a relatively small portion of their historic range, in particular Gunnison Sage-Grouse. So their decline really mirrors the decline of sagebrush across the West as well. And so while it looks pretty dire, that does mean there's a lot of opportunities for restoration. So that's the plus side. So threats across sagebrush rangelands can be somewhat variable based on the location itself, but I picked 5 of what I considered to be the biggest threats across the range of sage-grouse as a whole. I would say for Gunnison sage-grouse in particular, human development is by far the biggest risk. That can vary a little bit across the range just based off of like property values and that kind of thing. But in Gunnison, I think most of the biologists here would consider this to be one of the bigger threats. And part of the reason for that is that it's a full conversion. It's absolutely permanent. There's no going back from a subdivision to grouse habitat. And it's not always just a 1,400 square foot home that you're worried about. It's all of the roads and the power lines and the fences, and then the area that grouse are going to avoid because of a dog off leash and all of those kind of things that kind of spiral and create a really much bigger disturbance area than just the house itself. And then the other 4 threats that I listed are more based off of ecology, and these again are somewhat, I would say, ubiquitous in that they can occur in all of the areas that grouse occur, but they vary somewhat in how big of a threat they are locally. So brewering habitat is certainly a concern. Like I said, it's pretty limited to start with naturally, and then we have a lot of degradation in those areas, so that's further limiting what's available. Cheatgrass we'll talk about more in a little bit, but it increases fire frequency, and that can ultimately result in a habitat conversion similar to housing developments. And then I broke out invasive species into both cheatgrass and pinion and juniper. Pinion and juniper are native trees, but they are not native to sagebrush rangelands, and so they can really alter the hydrology of a system and increase predator perches. So those are also negative for grouse. And then the last thing we'll talk about is grazing management. I would say of all 5 threats listed here, grazing management is probably the least concern, but it's a relatively easy thing to fix. And so we often include this in almost all of our conservation plans. To make a really good habitat restoration plan, it's important to think about what the limiting factors are in an area. So if an area lacks brood-rearing habitat, that might result in low brood recruitment. And if the area has high adult mortality, that might be indicative of some sort of other factor, like having conifers or having a lack of understory cover or something like that. So it's really important to consider all of those things when you're developing a conservation plan so that you can really target the most important actions for that area. That being said, Gunnison Sage-Grouse are low enough in population size that we usually will target everything we possibly can. And I think that's often a practice in the areas with greater sage-grouse as well, because the more you can address, the better the habitat will be, and hopefully that'll result in a population level change. Restoration on private lands does have kind of some added layers of complexity. So what I guess what we just went through is kind of what a sage-grouse needs, and how we can identify good grouse habitat for certain life cycle needs. But since we're working on private land, obviously rancher interests are extremely important to consider. So usually the first step we do is identifying what their objectives are with their land. And usually there is a really clear link between what they need and what a grouse needs. And so the benefit is that usually there's not too much that's different here between grouse needs and rancher interests. But the other complicating factor is that as a federally listed species, we do have to consider policy and compliance requirements. And so that does shrink the available options a little bit, but for the most part, policy and compliance matches closely with sage-grouse needs. So really, we're looking for that little intersection in the middle, but that typically has a higher overlap than this picture shows. And I wanted to give just like a brief idea too of what conservation planning is actually like on the ground. So when we meet with landowners, they often come in with an idea in mind of what would be beneficial for their ranch or their operation. And then we'll work with them to really identify what other problems might exist that limit that opportunity. And then we'll go out and inventory what they have on the ground, which gives us an idea of what grouse have and what grouse need. And then from there, we'll come up with a few different ideas of how they could improve their land and how that would help their operation, and then give them some options as far as potential funding and other partners that might be able to provide more funding. They make a decision on what they want to do, and then we help them implement a plan. So help with scheduling contractors and all of those kind of logistics. And then from there, we'll evaluate how the restoration went and see if they want to take further steps and kind of keep moving that needle forward. So I want to give a better idea of what kind of restoration efforts we do for sage-grouse. Like I said, they'll vary based off of what area you're in, but they also vary based off of what the landowner wants to do, as well as what type of habitat even exists on the landowner's ranch. So the first threat, again, I wanted to just talk about human development. We don't do quite as much with this just because it's such a massive issue and requires some pretty specialized tools to deal with it. But because it's a permanent land use change, it's really important to address this for all of the reasons I talked about earlier, as far as reducing both the actual habitat, and then grouse will avoid certain areas. But also a lot of disturbance brings in weeds that can spread into surrounding areas. And then sometimes it'll provide predator perches or movement corridors for other types of predators. So again, human development is a really important thing to address. And the best way we can do that is to protect what already exists. So we will use conservation easements, which are a voluntary agreement between a private landowner and a land trust, in which land trusts will purchase development rights, and that prevents any future development in the habitat. So it's a huge, huge decision because these are in perpetuity. So once that decision is made, they can't buy back their development rights and decide they want to put in a subdivision. It's really going to look like that for as long as their ranch is in that parcel, essentially. And this is really important because keeping what already exists is much easier than trying to go back from any sort of development into sagebrush habitat. And keeping agricultural land in agriculture is really the best way to preserve that. So having sustainable ranches keeps more land open, and there's less land sold off to development. So this is a really, really important way to protect not just sage-grouse habitat, but habitat for all species of wildlife. The next threat that I mentioned was brewering habitat. So these are both pictures of some pretty severely degraded brewering habitat. It's really common to have issues in wet meadows like this, and they often result from cattle trailing, roads, recreational trails, and even historic wagon train routes. And in all of these, wet meadows and drainages are the easiest place for animals and people to travel. And so that's often where we build roads or trails. And in those scenarios, then the water will collect and it'll run down the drainage really fast rather than soaking into the area. And that can increase erosion. And then as that erodes, so in this bottom picture here where he's standing waist high in a drainage, this is called a head cut, and that will essentially just continue to erode and move up the valley. So eventually that drops the water table and you lose all of this wet meadow habitat. So it's really important to address these early. This is a little bit late, but something like this that's only a foot or so high is a perfect example of something that we can restore relatively easily. In most of these, we just work with some pretty simple restoration techniques. They're called sticks and stones restoration. They're hand-built structures. They're relatively small. This doesn't do a great job of showing scale, but this is probably about 2 feet wide by maybe 4 or 5 feet long. And as the water flows over them, it kind of tumbles over the rocks and slows down and drops out some of the sediment, and it'll start to reverse erosion. And as that happens, then it'll bring up the water table and increase the amount of wetland vegetation in an area. And that will increase the insect abundance in the area, which is what those chicks need from the start. So that's really the way to improve brewering habitat, is to bring back the insects. These are also great structures because, like I said, they're hand built, so it's relatively inexpensive. You can use rock on site. Sometimes rock is trucked in, but overall it's really just a pretty simple and inexpensive way for landowners to improve that habitat. The other huge benefit to it is that this is an example in Gunnison. Gunnison is relatively wet compared to a lot of other areas, so we have pretty dramatic results here. This is an example from the Upper Gunnison River Watershed Conservancy District. And they started construction in 2012, and then the next couple of photos are a couple of years after they finished construction. But in each picture, you can really see an increase in the amount of vegetation produced, and that's a huge benefit for landowners because they can use that extra grazing so they can keep their animals on the land a little bit longer. And then with the way hydrology is altered, it can also be green later in the year, and so sometimes that means they can be out on the range a little bit longer than they would have historically been. So they spend less money on hay, and so it's really just, it's a huge benefit for their bottom line. So this is a great win-win opportunity that most landowners are really interested in doing, just for the benefits to their livestock as well. The next threat was cheatgrass. And like I kind of alluded to, it increases fire frequency. So it'll form a lot of fine fuel in between sagebrush that is not necessarily how a native ecosystem looks. And then in the event of a fire, it'll sweep through really quickly. Sagebrush does not respond well to fire and can take hundreds of years to reestablish. So in that type of scenario, then you can end up with the cheatgrass monoculture. So if you all have ever been to the Great Basin, that's there are huge tracts there that are mostly just cheatgrass or have small patches of sagebrush. And that's really detrimental for grouse because they need the sagebrush for food and cover. So you at least need small patches of sagebrush. But this picture is a great example. This is actually in Idaho in the Great Basin. And when you don't have bunch grasses in between all of those sagebrush, you end up with really visible grouse. So that's a huge detriment for them when they're trying to avoid predators. So from a grouse perspective, cheatgrass is certainly a major threat, but it's also not great for livestock because cheatgrass is an annual, and so it's only green for a couple weeks every year. And then it's really not palatable for livestock to eat or big game. And so most ranchers are not a fan of cheatgrass, but it can be somewhat difficult to treat on a large scale. So this is something that is a really variable threat location to location. There are some areas where it's really pretty far gone, and then other areas where, like Gunnison, where we're really trying to combat it in its early stages. The best action we can take is to implement some pretty large scale cheatgrass treatments to try to prevent it from spreading further. In areas where it's a really small infestation, you can hand pull it, but that's certainly not recommended on a several thousand acre ranch. But a lot of folks can employ a contract spraying crew, and this is an example of a group out spraying. And when you have crews out, they'll often use this blue dye, and so you can just faintly see the outline of that. I'm tracing with my mouse here. And so that's really one of the ways that these large scale treatments are conducted is through either hand crews, or sometimes people will aerial spray. And I guess I should note too, pre-emergent herbicides, there are a handful of options there. They essentially just prevent cheatgrass seeds from germinating. There are, each cheatgrass plant can put out thousands of seeds, and so it's really important to prevent them from germinating. That can take years to get real control on that situation. So it sounds simple, but it's unfortunately not quite as simple as we would all like it to be. But it's by far the most effective opportunity to treat at large scales, just because we certainly don't have the manpower to be pulling on large scales. The next threat was Pinion and Juniper encroachment. Like I said, Pinion and Juniper are native trees. They're just not native in sagebrush ecosystems. And the real issue that grouse have with them is that they provide a perch for predators. And ravens, crows, magpies are all frequent nest predators. So it's certainly important to control that. And then certain raptors will also take out adults and chicks. So limiting predator perches is really important for grouse. But the other aspect of this that's really critical is the amount of water that Pinion and Juniper trees use. So each tree can use up to 45 gallons of water per day, which is an astonishing number. I mean, when you look at this photo, there's probably 24 trees. So if you do the math, that's an extraordinary amount of water to use throughout the year. And that over time will dry the landscape, and that makes it really difficult for grasses and wildflowers to live. And those are important food sources and cover for birds. So that's a problem. And then also Pinion and Juniper trees will catch snow as it falls on their branches, and then it doesn't soak into the ground. And so that kind of exacerbates the issues with hydrology. So Pinion and Juniper are an issue both for the predator perches and the hydrology impacts. So we certainly don't like to see them in the range of sage-grouse. But the bright side is it's a really quick and easy thing to deal with. It's expensive, but you can take out trees and grouse will return within a couple of months. So it's really effective in bringing birds back. There are really two ways to do it. You can masticate, which is what this top picture is of. It's just heavy equipment that mulches all of the trees. And then alternatively, you can hand cut. So this is an example of just hand cutting the trees, and then you spread the branches out to reduce erosion issues. Mastication and hand cutting both have their pluses and their minuses, but it's really site dependent on what you would want to use. But those are, again, just really quick and easy ways to return habitat to what it used to look like before the trees existed. It is somewhat complicated by how long trees have been present, because the longer they've been there, the more the hydrology has changed. But I have certainly heard stories of landowners taking out like 1,000 acres of trees and then having springs restored within a couple of years. So I think it can have a pretty drastic impact. It's maybe just not as quick as grouse return. So this is an example of some Pinion and Juniper removal down in southwestern Colorado. It's just a before and late in the year and then after early in the year. So there's no real change to the hydrology here yet, but it's certainly more open. It's easier for grouse to see predators and avoid predators. So it's a huge improvement in habitat for them. And the last threat I had really mentioned was grazing. There's really not a ton of research on grazing, but we can kind of make some inferences based off of what we know about grouse habitat and what they like to use, and then how grazing impacts all of the grasses on the landscape. And so we can make some inferences and assume that certain types of grazing can have a bigger influence on grouse. So when grouse are nesting, they're really reliant on grass cover from the previous year, just because they nest so early in the year. They're nesting from like April to June. And in April, I'm not sure where everybody's from on here, but in Gunnison, grasses in April are about 1 inch tall. And that's not really going to save a little nesting hen or anything like that from a predator. So they're pretty reliant on having grass cover from the previous year to help hide their nests. And then in long-term grazing, you can really change the composition of a understory so that it's either lacking food or cover for a grouse. So those are some really important concerns that are often the result of historic overgrazing. And then there's always been a kind of a suggestion or a thought that livestock could trample nests. It's documented extremely rarely, but it's really easy to avoid. So like I said, grazing management is something that we can address relatively easily by just timing grazing in a way that we can avoid nesting and brood rearing entirely. So that just, it totally eliminates the threat of trampling nests. And then you can change a lot of factors in a grazing rotation. So you can change the way or the amount of time or the number of animals that are grazing. And all of those will allow plants to go to seed and maintain some diversity on the landscape. And then the other really important factor is to have a minimum allowable post-grazing plant height. And this is a really common requirement for grazing on public lands. And essentially, it's what ensures that there's residual cover for future years so that grouse have some cover going into April. So those are, like I said, the 5 threats that I consider to be some of the most pertinent threats, but that's unfortunately not all of the threats that grouse face. So there are a number of other things we can do to improve conservation on the landscape. This photo is an example of having some fence markers that prevent grouse from flying into fences. They, especially with new fences, they have a tendency to fly into barbed wire. So if you hadn't noticed them, they're these little white tags. You can also do noxious weed treatments, seed disturbed areas, close unnecessary roads, and then put in all sorts of infrastructure to help with improving grazing. So in a lot of cases, that'll involve spring developments or watering facilities for livestock. And sometimes we'll put in new fences to help control where the animals go more closely. So really the best plan includes as much as you possibly can. Like I said, Gunnison Sage-Grouse are in a spot where it's really best to address as much as we possibly can versus just trying to target kind of the highest priority issue for that area. So when we're working with private landowners, we really have kind of a suite of options that we can ask what they're comfortable with and what they'd be interested in doing. And oftentimes, most of these treatments are really beneficial for landowners too. They bring more water back to the landscape or increase the amount of forage production. And so most landowners really are willing to implement a large proportion of these, which is really great to work with. So that's all I had. Wanted to open it up to questions. I have a hard time seeing the chat from here, so I'm going to go ahead and close down this presentation and be able to see what you guys have.
Awesome. Thanks, Marcella. I can also relay them over to you. there are some questions that came up, but first, thank you. That was such a great just overview about your work in grass conservation. So thanks for putting the time into that presentation. And we have a couple of questions. So Debbie's wondering, I guess, in your opinion, have you found that ranchers are choosing fracking and oil more often to supplement their income than what was previously chosen?
That's a really great question. I am not in an area that has a lot of oil and fracking, so that's fortunate for me. But, so I don't have a great answer for that. Income in various ways, whether that's having private land hunting tags, or some of them have all sorts of other kind of dude ranch activities with horseback riding and that kind of thing. So it's definitely common for ranchers to try to diversify income, but unfortunately, I don't have a good perspective here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, that's a good thing for you.
Yeah, I guess. Unfortunately, is not the right word.
Yeah. Debbie's also wondering, do you find more weeds coming in through with the sticks and stones restoration? And then how long are these restoration areas monitored?
Yeah, that's another really good question. So we have quarries that our local biologists have kind of vetted their quarries and make sure that they don't have very many weeds before even ordering rock from there. You could use locally sourced rock, but I would certainly make sure that it's in a weed-free area. For us, because of the compliance requirements, this sounds kind of crazy, but it's actually really difficult to be in compliance with federal law and collect rock on site. And so we almost always truck in rock, and that can be, you can essentially just pick a quarry that doesn't have a lot of weed seed. And then as far as how long they're monitored, that's also a good question. It's pretty variable. When those restoration methods were first being kind of pioneered in the area, it was really consistently monitored for about 5 years. And now that we have a better idea of how they work, the monitoring is, I would say, it's transitioned to be less quantitative data about vegetation and more like photo points and that kind of thing. And it's, I would say, moved from once a year to more like every other year or something like that.
Awesome. There's a couple more great questions. I love these. So for these grouse on land with cattle, how do these birds react to cattle? And then you kind of talked about the grazing impacts as far as nesting.
Yeah, that's a good question. There are all sorts of pictures on the internet of birds with cows. You can find birds actually displaying on their lek with pronghorn and elk and cows. They don't seem terribly bothered. Because they're ground dwelling, most grouse will wait until an animal is really close before they'll fly away. And it's somewhat variable as to if they'll fly away or if they'll just walk away. And I think from what I've seen, mostly they just walk away from cows instead of being startled enough to fly. And then as far as grazing impacts go, that's where we just don't have enough research. So we can kind of draw some lines and come up with some logical conclusions, but there really isn't enough research to say definitively how they react to grazing.
All right, the herbicide that you're talking about with the cheatgrass, is that safe for the other factors in the environment?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So pre-emergent herbicides prevent germination. And so theoretically, they could prevent germination for any type of seed. Because cheatgrass is so shallow rooted, it's really only in the top inch or two of the soil this herbicide interacts. And so for native species, they're relatively deep rooted, and so it really doesn't seem to have as big of an impact on them. So really it's cheatgrass, and then there's a whole slew of other invasive annual grasses. So all of the invasive annual grasses have a pretty similar life cycle, and so they all don't react well to the herbicide, but most of the natives seem to do okay. So.
Yeah, that's kind of I don't know. It's a whole thing. It's a whole. I'm sure you could do a lot more about that.
There's a lot of pathophysiology behind it.
Yeah, awesome. Just a couple more questions. When does the lekking occur, and is there a safe space to go and observe this without disturbing the grouse, like with a spotting scope?
Yeah. So For Gunnison Sage-Grouse in particular, there's one location that's okay to go watch grouse. Most of the locations are kept undisclosed to the public just because of the sensitivity of the bird. So I will type in the website and you could totally go check it out. I think it's .org, but it's siskiyou.org, and they have all of the information for viewing Gunnison Sage-Grouse. Graders are a little, I think you would have to get in contact with a local biologist to find a lek. They're usually not quite as sensitive, but anyway, so, and really you could look at like chambers of commerce and that kind of thing, and often they'll have local lek tours. So those are the best options.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Are ranchers willing to not let their cattle graze around lekking sites during the breeding season?
Yeah, so I think it probably does vary location to location. Here in Gunnison, most of the ranchers are really used to dealing with sage-grouse issues. So in this area, at least, they certainly can't graze on federal lands. Almost all of the federal lands don't allow cattle on during lekking and breeding season. And then private lands, it's really variable based on like what they have as far as like distance to lek and that kind of thing. But I would say it varies by community, but here we're really fortunate to have great ranchers that don't want to have a negative impact on the birds.
Yeah, that's good. So just one more question, then I have one last question to finish with it. Are you using drones in your work specifically?
Oh, yeah, I don't. I see so many opportunities. I would absolutely love to use them for monitoring, but I don't actually have the ability to do that at the moment.
Yeah, and Sally, we do use drones for other aspects of our work, especially out in the Great Plains. So some of our biologists are using drones, but not everyone. And then one last question. That looks like that was all of them. So why did you pick grouse? Why did you focus your research and your work around grouse?
That's a good question. It's ironic too, because the first time I went to go do a lek tour, my advisor for school invited me, and he's like, well, it's a little bit chilly and it's kind of early. And then I signed up, and he was like, all right, meet me at 4 a.m. and it's like 4 degrees in Gunnison and you're just sitting still for 6 hours. And it wasn't fun to start. And so I did, though, really get to enjoy it. Like, you get to see all sorts of cool things. You see like coyotes hunting on the lek, and you see amazing sunrises, and you see elk walking through the lek, and all sorts of cool stuff. So I think you get to enjoy a really special time in a special place with the birds, and that certainly grew on me. And the bright side, I guess, of having populations in decline is that there are a lot of opportunities to work with them. So once I started working with grouse, then it was relatively easy to continue to find positions and work that to stay involved with them. And I mean, from the videos, you guys can see they're really cool birds. So yeah, I very much enjoy working with them.
Awesome. One last question just came in real quick. Do you follow individual species with some kind of tagging? Do you do any like banding or radio tags?
I don't, but I have in the past. Gunnison is really, in Gunnison, most of the biologists are pretty leery of putting any sort of radio telemetry tags on birds, just because they are so sensitive to disturbance and their populations are so low. There have been more research projects in the past that we've been able to tag birds locally, or tag birds in other areas that then you just kind of transfer the information. So yeah, not as much here locally.
Awesome. Well, Marcella, thank you so much for presenting on your work this evening. I learned a bunch. I'm sure a lot of the folks here learned a lot. I just want to mention we will be doing some more presentations throughout the year. Our next presentation will be in May. So we've kind of slowed down a little bit with our virtual programming, which is nice because we're getting busier for in-person. But we're going to have another science or stewardship folk present on the work that they're doing, because it's really interesting. And I love sharing this with the wider community. If you would like to if you're in the, thank you, Marcella, for your email. I'll include that in the follow-up email as well. If you are in the Front Range of Colorado, Bird Conservancy, the education team, we're doing a lot of programming right now, and there's going to be more programming coming up. So if you want to go on a bird walk with us, or you want to check out some more areas, check out our events calendar on our website, and you can see kind of all that we're up to, because we're starting to get a lot more programming, which is exciting. But thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate it. I'll send out a lovely email with some resources and the recording of this if you missed a bit of it. So I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Hope you eat a great dinner. And again, thank you so much, Marcella, for presenting. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Appreciate it.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks.